I know you think history is boring, but I found someone I bet can change your mind. James Garfield.
Greetings.
Sure, I may be Mr. Beat, but this is James Garfield. Well, actually, it's just a bobblehead of James Garfield. I got it at his house. For real, dude. I'm not playing. And Chris from Vlogging Through History even joined me. It was so Ohio. In fact, it was about as Ohio as you could get. Ohio has produced more American presidents than any other state except Virginia. And of those, James Garfield might just be my favorite. Somebody who is not really remembered much at all, but I think he was actually pretty great guy.
Yeah, intelligent guy, young, late 40s, very charismatic.
He could have been the greatest president in American history. We just don't know.
And we here in Ohio will stand by that. We love our Garfield here.
Now, he's not my favorite Ohio president because of what he actually accomplished. He's my favorite Ohio president because of what he could have accomplished. This is literally what society would look like if not for the fact that, he was assassinated. I'm not talking about John F. Kennedy or Abraham Lincoln here. I'm talking about James Garfield. Other presidents were assassinated, James Garfield was assassinated. And he died just 199 days after taking office. And about 79 of those days, or nearly 40% of the time he was president, he was slowly dying in excruciating pain. The only president who served a shorter term than Garfield? William Henry Harrison, who died just 31 days into his presidency. But unlike Harrison, no disrespect to Harrison, but unlike Harrison, Garfield was awesome, man. He was a legit better person than most other presidents. He was one of the most intelligent, most progressive, and least corrupt presidents in American history. Whenever American history dorks like myself bring up Garfield, they frame him as the biggest what if president.
What if there's so much that could have been accomplished, and who knows what we missed out on because he died so early in his term.
What if James Garfield got to serve a full term, or even 2 full terms, or more? Hey, remember, this was before the 22nd Amendment. How much better off would the United States have been? Well, in my humble opinion, I think the United States would have been much better off had Garfield lived. And by the end of this video, I hope you understand why I feel that way. James Abram Garfield was born on November 19th, 1831, in a log cabin in Orange Township, Ohio. Yes, another log cabin president. But, bruh, that's not literally the cabin. Just chillax. It's a replica. It's now part of Moreland Hills, not that far from Cleveland. Heck, the Moreland Hills Police Department is right next to where he was born, and so are some people's backyards. Oh yeah, that's Chris from Vlogging Through History. We met up for a day to check out Garfield sites in northeastern Ohio, which is where Chris is from. Even did some hiking to the exact spot where his birthplace was. Anyway, James was the youngest of 5 kids. James had no memory of his father, Abram. When he was a toddler, Abram saved the family farm from a wildfire, but in doing so, probably breathed in too much smoke and caught a fever. He'd die a couple days later on May 8th, 1833. This left James's mom, Eliza, in charge of the family homestead, a homestead that already had a lot of debt. To pay off this debt and to feed her 5 young children, Eliza sold off most of the land. Garfield grew up dirt poor. He had one of the poorest upbringings of all American presidents, if not the poorest. Young James didn't own his first pair of shoes until he was 4 years old. Eliza believed the ticket to prosperity was education. She even donated some of her land so a schoolhouse could be built on it, as long as her children could attend. She especially saw potential in her youngest son, James, who had a pretty easy time learning stuff compared to other kids. When he wasn't studying or reading, he'd be working in the fields, especially in the spring. James was incredibly clumsy, always injuring himself. And as he recovered, he'd read a lot. He often read about life at sea. Although James lived hundreds of miles from an ocean and he was a horrible swimmer, he dreamed of becoming a sailor. In fact, when he was 16 years old, he devastated his mom when he abruptly left home to try to become a sailor. The furthest he got was the Ohio and Erie Canal, a canal his dad helped build, as a matter of fact. He guided animals pulling canal boats. It was tough work. He sometimes worked as much as 15 hours a day. After falling into the canal one night and nearly drowning, Garfield was like, okay, I'm done working the boats, and headed home, where he then spent the next 2 months nearly dying again, sick in bed after getting malaria from the water he fell in. But he did recover, now determined to go to college while also becoming more religious, attending camp meetings or Christian revival outdoor gatherings that often featured a bunch of music and charismatic preachers. James also began attending Geauga Seminary, but still working part-time as a field hand, then later as a carpenter and teacher. Yep, he was such a good student that he taught other students. At Geauga, James joined debate club and became fascinated with how a speaker could captivate an audience. Eventually, he'd become quite a good speaker himself. Also at Geauga, he met Lucretia Rudolph, who he was very attracted to. Around this time, James became a committed member of the Disciples of Christ. He even became a preacher. In 1851, at the age of 19, Garfield got accepted into a small college in Hiram, Ohio, called the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, today simply called Hiram College. Since he couldn't afford tuition, he worked as a janitor in exchange for his education. By his second year there, the college was so impressed with him as a student that they made him an assistant professor. Not only was he the smartest student there, he was arguably the most popular student there. Lucretia also attended the institute, and she would also become a teacher. By that time, the two had fallen in love, and Garfield proposed to her. However, the wedding would have to be postponed as Garfield transferred to Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. The two would write love letters back and forth, but while at Williams College, Garfield also got in a relationship with a woman named Rebecca Selleck. Oh no, a love triangle. Well, James ultimately returned to Lucretia, but the two wouldn't get married until November 11th, 1858. They had a somewhat rocky marriage in those early years, especially since Garfield was rarely home, but ultimately the two's love would grow as they got older. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Before that, after graduating from Williams College, second in his class, Garfield had traveled around a bit before ultimately returning to the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, this time as a professor. He taught everything from English to Latin to Greek to history to geology to mathematics. He did so well, the institute soon made him the principal. In his spare time, he studied to become a lawyer. You know, for funsies. He'd passed the bar exam in 1861. But 2 years before this, when he was still principal at the Eclectic Institute, politics came a-calling. Garfield was very interested in politics, but wasn't necessarily interested in becoming a politician. And yet, his combination of intelligence, charisma, and faith made him a natural leader, so much that others thought he'd be an excellent politician. When an Ohio state senator suddenly died in the summer of 1859, Garfield agreed to run for Congress spot as long as he didn't have to beg people to support him. Well, he easily won the election. However, just over a year after Garfield had entered politics, the bloodiest conflict in American history had begun: the American Civil War. Garfield was clearly on the Union side, a supporter of President Lincoln, and not only a strong abolitionist, but someone who thought that African Americans should be treated equally to everyone else. Garfield didn't hesitate, leaving the legislature for the battlefield, volunteering for the Union Army, and quickly rising through the ranks. Now 30 years old, he became the colonel of the 42nd Regiment, enthusiastically recruiting dudes from Hiram, many of them students of the Eclectic Institute. The 42nd's first mission was to fight back the growing rebel forces in Kentucky. In January 1862, Garfield commanded troops in Floyd County, where he encountered Confederate forces led by the much more experienced Humphrey Marshall. Marshall had more than 2,000 soldiers. Garfield had less than 1,500 soldiers and no artillery. Still, despite Garfield's inexperience, he was able to lead his forces to victory in what became known as the Battle of Middle Creek. This victory got Garfield nationwide recognition and a promotion to Brigadier General. However, the following summer, he had to take a break from the war after getting sick pretty badly. Around that time, a bunch of Ohioans convinced Garfield to run for the U.S. House of Representatives. Even though Garfield didn't campaign at all, he got more than 66% of the vote. Garfield didn't want to leave the army and only finally decided to serve in Congress after President Lincoln convinced him he was needed more in Congress than on the battlefield. And thus marked the beginning of a 17-year career in the U.S. House of Representatives. From the very beginning, Garfield didn't hide the fact that he thought that slavery was not only really bad, but that blacks deserved 100% the same rights as whites. For that, he got called a radical Republican, since it was so radical to be for civil rights and stuff. Freaking humans. Aww. So disappointing at times. Even as a brigadier general, he refused to obey an order to capture a runaway slave. One of the first things he did in Congress was introduce a resolution to allow blacks to walk freely on the streets of D.C. He was one of the first members of Congress to call for African Americans to have the right to vote and argued they needed extra protections against racist laws toward them. Throughout his career, he'd worked to get several African Americans appointed to prominent positions. Meanwhile, he and Lucretia had started a family. They'd have 7 children together. Eliza died when she was 3, and Edward died when he was just 1. The other 5, Harry, James Rudolph, Mary, Irvin, and Abram, all lived to adulthood. The loss of his daughter, Eliza, particularly devastated Garfield. It had happened right before he entered Congress. Around that time, Garfield had also had an affair with a journalist named Lucia Runkle. I said Lucia Runkle, not Lucia your uncle. Garfield ended the affair when Lucretia found out about it, and he may have had even more affairs. It's worth noting that I had no idea about all these affairs until I started researching for this video. By the end of the Civil War, Garfield had become known as a leader in Congress. He was the first to speak out about rich people being able to buy their way out of serving in the military. He even found time to write up an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem when he got bored, which later got published in the New England Journal of Education. Dang. And what helped him be a good leader? His riz, baby. Always a fan of hearing himself talk, Garfield gave more speeches in Congress than most of his colleagues, but it's all good. He was pretty good at talking, but still poor, still not making much money. Due to this, he began taking on cases as a lawyer. In 1866, he defended Indiana men who had been sentenced to death for aiding the Confederacy. His Republican colleagues were horrified, but Garfield took on the case in principle and won, I should add. Garfield also was against the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson. Okay, well, at least at first. And sure, Garfield supported the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But in the late 1860s, he began to moderate his views from the more radical wing of the Republican Party. For example, he thought that the Enforcement Act, aka the Ku Klux Klan Act, gave the president too much power. This moderation of views even hurt his friendships in Congress. For example, he famously drifted apart from his once good friend, Salmon Chase, during this time. Garfield served on the House Ways and Means Committee, where he publicly supported the gold standard. Later, he headed the very powerful House Appropriations Committee, where he prioritized more federal funding for technology, exploration, and education, but at the same time wanted to get rid of government waste. Throughout the 1870s, Garfield often talked trash about the spoil system, aka patronage, which basically said you should reward the people who got you elected. In general, Garfield hated how there were all these special deals between the government and corporations that politicians benefited from. But hold up, punk. Oh no, not you again. How do you keep finding me? What about the credit mobilier scandal? Mobilier. Wasn't he involved with that, huh? Okay, look. Garfield did buy a few shares of Credit Mobilier through friends before the scheme got exposed, but there is absolutely no evidence that he knowingly took part in the bribery or tried to cover anything up. So back off, all right? In 1876, Garfield bought a house in Menor, Ohio. Yep, Chris from Vlogging Through History and myself got to check this place out firsthand, along with a new friend.
The general feeling is that it's a huge point of pride for the people, not just in Menor, but Lake County, especially in Northeast Ohio in general. I mean, I wouldn't say that everybody has an obsessive understanding of everything he did or why he was important, but it's more like, this is our boy, he's from Northeast Ohio.
He's a guy who I think of as having multiple opportunities to go different ways. I mean, obviously, he could have spent his whole life in ministry because he was a preacher, could have spent his whole life in education because of his role as a professor and a college president, could have had a great military career, was highly regarded, won a battle in eastern Kentucky, leading troops on his own, was rising through the ranks, but decided to go into politics and got elected to Congress.
By this time, Garfield had become the top-ranking Republican in a role we now call the minority leader. Still, while his leadership maintained Republican cohesion during a time after the Civil War known as Reconstruction, the Republican Party was quite split. And wouldn't you know it, the two major groups that emerged during this time disagreed about civil service reform. Civil service reform, meaning getting rid of the aforementioned spoil system and replacing it with merit-based hiring and promotion practices, MAN. Anyway, those two groups were the stalwarts and the half-breeds. The stalwarts wanted to keep the spoil system in place. The half-breeds wanted to get rid of it. By the way, they got that name because their opponents thought of them as only half Republican. Anyway, Garfield, probably not surprisingly, lined up with the half-breeds, but still strangely had the respect of many stalwarts. Jump ahead to January 1880, and the Ohio General Assembly elected Garfield to the U.S. Senate. That said, his term would not begin until the following year. In June, Garfield arrived in Chicago to attend the Republican National Convention. He was there to nominate John Sherman for president in the upcoming election. Garfield had no desire to seek seek the presidency himself. In fact, he was nervous about becoming a senator. At the convention, he gave a calm but well-received speech in support of Sherman to be the Republican nominee for president. However, Sherman had competition, notably both former President Ulysses Grant and U.S. Senator James Blaine wanted the nomination as well. After several ballots, no leading candidate emerged. And then something crazy happened. Delegates began to flip their votes to Garfield. And of course, this freaked Garfield out. He did not want to become the nominee for president. On the 36th ballot, Garfield apparently became the compromise candidate. In response to getting the nomination, Garfield was overwhelmed. Seriously, bud. All evidence shows that he was not expecting to run for president, nor was he wanting to. Since Garfield was associated with the half-breeds, the Republican Party nominated Chester Arthur, a supposed stalwart, as his running mate. Garfield conducted what many historians consider to be the first successful front porch campaign, or a campaign in which the candidate mostly just hangs out at home, instead of going out on the road to campaign. Yep, that's the porch right there. It's pretty cool that it's still preserved there. So many people came here to offer their support and hope for support in return. Yeah, more on that in a bit. Foreshadowing. In the third closest presidential election in American history, an election with a really high voter turnout, Garfield just barely defeated a fellow Civil War veteran, Winfield Hancock, becoming the 20th president of the United States. Garfield's presidency began with so much promise. He sought to improve relations and open up trade with other countries. He advocated for a more humane approach toward Native Americans. Oh, don't get me wrong, he still had racist views toward American Indians. But I think he would have been less bad than at least the next few Republican presidents as far as policy toward them. Most importantly, it seemed that the country was on a clear path toward civil service reform now that Garfield was chief executive. And Garfield modeled it with his cabinet picks. These were dudes who were well qualified. Dudes like the aforementioned James Blaine as his Secretary of State and William Windom as his Secretary of the Treasury. But it wasn't just his cabinet. He consistently appointed qualified professionals over party loyalists to reform the federal bureaucracy. Another priority, civil rights enforcement, especially since Jim Crow laws had started to pop up in southern states. Little did Garfield know that he wouldn't have much time to get his legislative priorities passed. You see, on just his 121st day as president, July 2nd, 1881, Garfield and some of his advisors and staff arrived at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. They were headed on vacation, and several local newspapers had reported about Garfield's trip in particular. That's how Charles Guiteau, a man with a history of mental illness, knew Garfield was going to be there. Guiteau had falsely believed that his campaigning had been extremely important to Garfield becoming president, and that Garfield owed him a diplomatic post someplace cool in Europe because of it. Dadgummit. Well, after not getting any diplomatic post or even hearing back at all from the Garfield administration, Guiteau believed that God had told him to kill the president. Garfield had no bodyguard, no security team. As the president entered the train station's waiting room, Guiteau came right up to him and shot him at point-blank range from behind. My God, what is this? Garfield reportedly exclaimed. The bullet had just grazed Garfield's shoulder, so Guiteau shot him again. The second bullet entered Garfield's back, and he collapsed to the floor. Guiteau ran outside the station, but then, and I'm not joking, ran right into a police officer who promptly arrested him and asked him, "In God's name, man, what did you shoot the president for?" Guiteau responded, "I am a stalwart and want Arthur for president." Guiteau's trial later was one of the first in which the insanity defense was considered. Guiteau was hoping he'd be released so that he could actually run for president himself afterward. But nah, man. that didn't happen. Guiteau was found guilty and executed. Anyway, Garfield didn't immediately die. In fact, he'd survive another 79 days. And if it weren't for his doctors completely and utterly screwing things up, he likely would have survived a lot longer and maybe even completely recovered. While trying to get his bullet out with unsterilized fingers and tools, they caused a severe infection. Some historians today even accuse Garfield's lead doctor, Willard Bliss, of medical malpractice. Bliss ignored advice of other doctors who thought that digging around for the bullet was making it worse. One of those doctors Bliss ignored, Susan Ann Edson, a longtime family doctor of the Garfields. Should have listened to her, Bliss. James Garfield died on September 19th, 1881. He was just 49 years old, the second youngest American president to ever die. Even though his assassination was less than 16 years after the assassination of another president, Abraham Lincoln, the nation was still shocked. I firmly believe that James Garfield could have been one of the greatest presidents of all time. He was a truly one-of-a-kind president. Pragmatic, decisive, hardworking, brilliant, humble, open-minded, honest, extremely principled, and, most importantly, empathetic. He rose from extreme poverty to the highest office in the land, armed with nothing but intelligence, determination, and sure, he had some riz too. He might have ended government corruption, dramatically advanced civil rights, and more quickly modernized the United States during a particularly crucial time. But instead, he became a victim, not just of an assassin's bullet, but of doctors who didn't know what the heck they were doing. Then again, perhaps we give way too much credit to individuals in history, especially individuals who lead during times of relative peace and stability, which is probably a big reason why the presidents before and after Garfield are also barely remembered in history. Heck, all the facial hair presidents of the bearded age, as I call it, the presidents between 1869 and 1897, are mostly forgotten today. And that's possibly because there were no violent revolutions or big wars going on during that time in the United States. Would the country really be that dramatically different today if Garfield wasn't assassinated? Well, civil service reform would happen anyway. As a matter of fact, just over 15 months after Garfield died, his successor, Chester Arthur, would sign the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. A backlash to the Gilded Age probably would have happened anyway as well. Civil rights? Here's where I think Garfield's untimely death proved most costly. He was very clear about how he thought African Americans needed extra protections, especially in the South. In the years after Garfield's death, the Supreme Court consistently reversed federal protections for African Americans, and they became second-class citizens as racial segregation became institutionalized. Obviously, this is just speculation, but I do believe this trend would have been less likely to happen if Garfield survived to be president for 8 years, instead of just, for less than 6 months. Today, James Garfield is mostly just an answer to a trivia question, but in my humble opinion, I think he deserves to be much more than that. He deserves to be remembered as one of the greatest lost opportunities in American history. James Garfield. Thanks to Chris from Vlogging Through History for collaborating with me for this video. Make sure you subscribe to his channel. Also, I'm somewhat strategically releasing this video before the release of the Netflix miniseries Death by Lightning, which is about James freaking Garfield. It premieres on my birthday, and I'm really excited to watch it. What better birthday present for Mr. Beat than a miniseries about James Garfield? And that miniseries is based off the book Destiny of the Republic by Candice Millard. I relied on this book heavily to research for this video. I also read this book, President Garfield, From Radical to Unifier by C.W. Goodyear. All other sources I used researching for this video are in the description. You should read and stuff. And now it's time for my monthly shout out to all my Patreon supporters who donate at least $15 or more each month to my channel, starting in reverse alphabetical order with my biggest donors. Thank you to Zachary Pascalar, Sean Connett, Robin Tooley, Raquel Jones, Ralph W.K., Patrick Stewart, Pat Iapicca, Nick Everett, Nicholas Dronsky, Mater Tenenbaum, Little Lufha, Joe Cook, Jesus Carrillo, Jeremy Dunham, Empty Machine, Elias Pierce, Corey Ryman, Clayton Carlisle, Chams McGuffey, Chris McKinnon, Brennan Fletcher, Austin Ciros, Anthony Beckett, Andrew B., Alicia Solberg, Zachary F. Parker, Victor McLean, Ty Marwitz, TC, Steve Bryan, Salty, Ralph, Nathan Hale, Naderade, Michael Burt, Josh, Jacob Birnbaum, Jack L., Grant Gagaza, Fame and Fortune Guaranteed in the State of Kentucky, Emily Glover Wilson, Andrew Schneider, Aditya Anand, and Adam Christians. Thank you to all my Patreon supporters and channel members, and thank you for staying curious.